Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for people to join the webinar. So people are coming in now. So while that continues, I'll start with my hello remarks. Hello, everyone, to this evening's event. We're going to be discussing Can Palestine Be Free? Today's forum is hosted by the socialist media site Labour Outlook and the events platform Arise, a festival of left ideas. You know, everyone is aware of the world events at the moment. So I'm sure we all agree it's a particularly important discussion with the latest Israeli government atrocities that we've seen against the Palestinian people, actions that are being widely condemned around the globe, including by the UN General Assembly the other day, and a number of aid and human rights organisations around the world as well. For many of us who've been active in solidarity with Palestine and the Palestinian people over the years, the last few weeks have been further confirmation of the need to not only stand firmly in solidarity with the Palestinian people, but also call out our own British government, the US, and others for their backing of Israel's illegal occupation and abuses of human rights, including through continued arms sales. So to discuss this and sort of some of the history, we're joined today by Bernard Regan, who's a long-term campaigner for and writer on Palestinian rights. Bernard's a member of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign Executive Committee, and author of the Balfour Declaration, Empire, Mandate and Resistance in Palestine. He was the first recipient of what was then the NUT, the National Union of Teachers, Steve Sinnott Award in 2015 in recognition of his contribution to international solidarity. So we want to have as many questions and comments from you, the audience, as possible tonight. Because of the size of the audience today, we've got volunteers who are going to be facilitating this through the Q&A function in Zoom. So please post both your comments for discussion and your questions to Bernard in the Q&A function. And then after Bernard's introduction, we'll have time for a few rounds of questions from the audience. So please start thinking of your questions now. And if you can, to keep doing events like this, we're going to be posting different links throughout Bernard's talk, some about his book, but also other relevant campaign links, but also occasionally a donate link will come up. So please bear in mind these links and you'll be able to see them at the end as well. But right now, I'm going to turn straight to our speaker for tonight, Bernard Regan.
Thank you very much, Sean, and thank you to the organisers for organising this event. I think it's an extremely important discussion to have, and a very urgent one to have. I'm going to begin by just sort of recalling to ourselves the current situation, because clearly what is happening at the moment is absolutely horrendous. I know that many of you will be watching these events on the television and be following news reports and so on, so you are familiar with them, but the scale of it is significantly different. Israel has, over the last 20 odd years, attacked Gaza on a number of occasions. The numbers of fatalities that have occurred in those, which of course have been unjustified and too high, but has been at the most in the couple of thousands. But we're now looking at a scenario where it's, I think, realistic to talk about 20,000 Palestinians in Gaza having been killed, having been murdered. Of those, something like 50% are women and children. And of the 2.3 million population of Gaza, 1.8 million of those are displaced, many of them sheltering in schools, like the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which has 156 schools in which people are sheltering. But tragically, that has not saved them from the bombing that the Israeli Air Force and the Israeli military are carrying out. They claim that the targets are strategic targets related to Hamas, but it's very clear that they are bombing, I think, quite calculatedly. I don't think it's indiscriminate. It's quite calculated. And And it's quite clear to me that it is appropriate to use the word genocide when we're talking about the situation that the Palestinians face in Gaza. We see, if you look at the statistics, that of those who have been killed, there are something like 300 families, I believe, who have lost more than 10 members of their family. In other words, it's very clear that we're talking about people's homes that are being bombed and destroyed. And far from having any kind of military significance, it's clear, as I said, that this is a genocidal act that's being taking place. We also know that the brutality of this, I think, is displayed by the way in which they're not only quite indiscriminate, but that they are really in a blanket way carrying out bombings. And two military kind of theses, if you like, a set of ideas inform that. One is called the Hannibal Directive, which is a policy of the Israeli army that even where there are their own hostages being held by an opponent like Hamas in this case, but like Hezbollah in previous years, they are quite prepared to destroy everyone in that building or in those buildings where any hostages might be being held if they can't retrieve them. So that is, one of the facets and an exemplar, if you like, of the way in which they operate. And the other is a thing called the Dahia Doctrine, named after a southern suburb of Beirut, where they went in and just carpet bombed a whole area. So what they're doing in Gaza is not something new. The attack in Dahia in South Beirut occurred in 2008. So what I want to say, just underline, is that this is not a war, in my view, on Hamas. It is a war on the Palestinian people. And I think that's also confirmed by the way in which they're conducting themselves, that is, the Israeli military are conducting themselves in the West Bank. There are something like 280 odd people who have been killed since the 7th of October, and about 3,500, maybe 4,000 now, people arrested and detained. So there's a repressive operation going on in the West Bank, clearly designed to squash any form of solidarity, any form of manifestation that might express support for those suffering in Gaza or resisting. And it's equally the case inside Israel itself. Palestinians within Israel, or 48 Palestine, as Palestinians often call it, are facing a situation where they are not able to express their views, to express their solidarity. I mean, one example was in Nazareth recently, where there was an attempt to hold a demonstration. Demonstrations normally held at the entrance to towns, but this was organized in the center of the town. And despite that, it was attacked by the Israeli police who broke it up. So there's a real offensive going on against all Palestinians, in my view. So when people talk about a war on Hamas or a war on Gaza, it's a war on Palestinians. Clearly, Gaza is the front line and the one that is suffering most of that. And it's obvious also that they planned it in some detail. You can see that from these maps that they produce, where they say, these are the squares that we're going to attack, and this is where you should go to, and all of that kind of thing, which we know is not true because the evidence for that is there for everyone to see. But that kind of detailed mapping and targeting and use of AI is something that's kind of quite widespread. So there is a clear attempt, in my view, to destroy not only schools and so on, but hospitals and the whole social infrastructure of Gaza. And this is important because when we come to talk about peace, what will it look like for the people of Gaza? On top of that, they've cut off a long time ago electricity, gas, water supply, but now they're discussing the question of flooding the tunnels that they allege Hamas was using and have been kind of a part of the military operation that's carried out, and flooding it with seawater. Now, why this is significant is because Gaza relies for a large part on an aquifer, which is called the coastal aquifer, that runs down, as the name suggests, the coastline. And it's from there that they get some of their drinking water. But what has been happening in recent years, well, over a period of time, but has accelerated in recent years, is that aquifer is becoming polluted with an ingress of salt water. So the Israelis are now talking about flooding their tunnels, and that will, they say, is in order to disrupt the operations of Hamas through those tunnels, but it will actually also further damage the aquifer, further damage the water supply. And so the Palestinians in Gaza are wholly dependent on water from Israel to survive. And it's just like 1948. I won't go into detail, but in 1948, when the Israeli state came into being, it was preceded by what was called Plan Dalet, which is spelt out by historians like Ilan Pappé and Avi Shlaim and Noor Masala and others, explaining that they had a systematized plan of what they were going to do in terms of attacking villages and towns and terrorizing people, carrying out massacres in places like Deir Yassin and Tantura, Accra, Saliha, and Lida, where they killed 250 people. So it is a repetition of this, and it's interesting because one of the Israeli politicians has talked about this being the second war of independence, the first war of independence being 1948, this being the second is what they call it. And in my view, it is what the Palestinians would call it and what it should rightly be called, the Nakba, a second Nakba that is taking place. Despite, and we've seen this again in the media and widely reported, attempts by many people to intervene to try to prevent this war continuing, seeking a ceasefire. In the General Council, the General Assembly, rather, of the United Nations yesterday, an absolutely overwhelming vote, 153 nations voting for a ceasefire, 10 voting against, and 23 abstaining, including disgracefully the United Kingdom. When you look at those 10 countries, apart from the two obvious ones of United States and Israel, some of them are very tiny, basically colonies of the United States. I think that's not an uncharitable thing to say, but who have a track record of being simply, a vote for the United States on any policies it decides to act on. So it's an unexceptional set of people that voted against the ceasefire, but there was a clear and overwhelming call. And I don't think, that I've seen, and I think it's very hard to recall an example where a Secretary General of the United Nations has intervened so vehemently to call for action by the United Nations organization to intervene and to stop what is happening. I mean, other people on the call may know better than me, but probably the last I can remember of any similarity, it was in the case of the Congo when Dag Hammarskjöld tried to secure the methods by which Patrice Lumumba and the Congolese were trying to assert their independence against the Belgians and others, and the Americans, the CIA, of course, who were involved. So it's very clear that there was an overwhelming intervention that took place, and that vote was very clear. It's just, we know this, but of course it makes a nonsense of this so-called international community that people sometimes appeal to as kind of the arbiters of justice and legitimacy, when what one can see is de facto it's a question of what is the position that the Americans take. They're not the only significant figure, but in this instance they are significant in terms of the intervention that they've made. So what are the chances of a ceasefire taking place and negotiations happening? Well, I think you have to look at some of the players in this scenario, and beginning by looking at the Israeli cabinet itself. And one of the things that I think is a common phenomena, and is certainly present in this government, is the presence of military figures, former generals of the Israeli Defense Force, or the Israeli Occupation Force, as we ought to call it, who are members of political parties and are now sitting in the cabinet and deciding the course of the war as it goes ahead. The government that's been elected, which was elected at the end of 2022, is, I think, by all consensus, the most right-wing government. And I know, that might seem hard to believe because there's been a plethora of right-wing governments in Israel, but it is the most right-wing government that we have seen. Apart from Netanyahu, it's composed of a mixture of former generals and people who are utterly right-wing racists, and that's possibly a charitable way of describing them. The generals include people like Yoav Gallant, Benny Gantz, Gadi Eisenkot, all of these who have in the past been involved in military operations against the Palestinians of one kind and another. You have people like Bezalel Smotrich, who himself is a settler, who has said that in his view, there are 2 million Nazis in the West Bank, and therefore, of course, should be treated like the Nazis. And he's also gone on to say there's no such thing as Palestinians, echoing a comment made by a former Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, who said the same thing, with the implication that Palestinians could leave the West Bank and could be driven into Jordan, for example, or Lebanon or Egypt. And that's the mentality of the people you're dealing with. People who hold ministerial positions, but at the same time are members of this war cabinet, determining the course that this action will take. And another one, Itamar Ben Gvir, who is describes himself as a Kahanist, a follower of a particular cult within Israel, who amongst whom was a man called Baruch Goldstein, who went into the mosque in Hebron, Al Khalil, and murdered more than 20, I think it was 27, 28 people. And Ben Gvir had a picture of this murderer on his wall in his house. So this is the character of some of the people who form the cabinet, which is making decisions. It's true, I think, to paraphrase the writer on Prussian history, Friedrich von Schotter, who said, when he said, Prussia is not a country with an army, but an army with a country. And that's been said of Israel too, that it's not a country with an army, but an army with a country. And you can see that in all sorts of ways. I mean, I won't go into it, but if you look at the curriculum in schools, the way in which the army is kind of consistently celebrated, even from kindergarten, there is an army day, children dress up in military uniform and so on. And there's this kind of glorification of the military. And one could go into that in more detail, but the whole ideology is built around the army as a central feature of the life of Israel. So the challenge that the Palestinians face is extremely strong. It's one in which what we've seen in recent years has been the introduction of even further measures to discriminate against Palestinians in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and in Gaza, but also within the state of Israel. There are an estimated something like 50 odd laws within the Israeli legal system which are explicitly discriminating or have de facto impact on things like employment, on things like promotion, on things like what is taught in schools, and all of the curriculum within the universities, access to certain areas of employment. All of these things kind of are components within that. And that is, part of the kind of whole ethos of how Israel operates. Now, I think one has to look at, and I'll just jump slightly to the role of the United States of America. It's been very much involved, even since the early 1950s, when it was giving funds to the Israeli government, funds which by and large were used for military purposes. For example, under the Obama administration, they voted a 10-year program of $3.8 billion a year to Israel, which was under the heading of aid, but in fact, 99.7% of that money was spent on military operations, military equipment, and so on and so forth. And as I said, that's been going on since 1951. So the United States is heavily involved in providing financial aid. It's somewhat, therefore, in my view, completely hypocritical and dishonest and dismissive of the notion that Biden and Blinken have any real concern about the conduct of the Israelis in terms of abiding by international law. It's a nonsense when, on the one hand, they're making these comments, whilst on the other, they're giving Israel massive and colossal amounts of arms in the course of that. Bunker busting bombs, thousands of shells. They have 2 warships in the Eastern Mediterranean, which are there as a clear threat to anyone else not to intervene. They're providing all of the arms which are stored inside Israel. They're making them available for the Israeli military in the event that they need them. So this idea that somehow Biden and Blinken are kind of trying to moderate Israel, in my view, is it's fallacious. It's not worth really a serious discussion. But I do think that the Americans recognize that there are challenges. They, through Trump in particular, initiated a whole program, and this is coming on to the regional questions, which was aimed at incorporating and drawing in the reactionary regimes of many of the bodies across countries across the Western Asia, Middle East, as we call it, into a collaboration with the Israeli regime and getting them to sign up through what was called the Abraham Accords, a converging set of relationships. And I think what has happened with these events in Gaza is that has really blown that open for the time being, because many of those governments recognize that that policy in the present context is completely unpopular. One even saw, as a very small indicator early on at the World Cup, the Arab crowds who were there and many of the football teams from Arab countries who were there carrying the Palestinian flag. And amongst the Palestinian masses, and amongst the Arab masses rather, there is clear support for the rights of the Palestinians to go forward. We can see that happening in the Middle East. And America is slightly kind of apprehensive about what's going on, because it's not anymore a sole player. In recent months, China has helped to get some sort of border accommodation between the Saudis and Iran, and has also kind of extended its influence, because it's building, as you know, the Belt and Road land corridor for transporting Chinese goods into European and other markets. But it has also a maritime Belt and Road plan, which is terminating in the head of the Arabian Gulf. And so having the Saudis and the Iranians come into an accommodation would be an important part to achieve that. So that's another factor why the Americans are slightly apprehensive about what's going on. There have been demonstrations in Oman, there have been demonstrations in other parts of the Arab world, in Yemen and so on. And clearly the apprehension there would be if, as a result of the Americans appearing to be too supportive of Israel, that alienation spread not only to demonstrating solidarity with the Palestinians in those respective countries, but that it presaged another potential Arab Spring in the area, which would clearly be something to challenge the United States' interest. The area, for example, still holds more than 50% of the world's oil reserves and 53%, I think it is, of the world's gas reserve. So it's an area that the United States has very much material interest in that. So we can see that, there are lots of factors that make the Americans cautious about what's happening. So what about the reality of the situation, and is it possible to conceive of a peace? Certainly from the point of view of the United States and amongst the Israeli military, they're talking about the day after, as they call it. In other words, what happens when they achieve what they perceive to be their objectives. And I don't think that they can, because they see it almost exclusively, I think, in military terms, and a lot of Western commentators follow the same route, and they think Hamas is solely a military organization, but it's not. It has a quite broad political movement behind it. Many of you will remember that in 2006, it actually won a majority in the Palestinian Authority in the elections, including seats in the area of the West Bank. So to have a crude notion that the West Bank is Fatah and the Gaza is Hamas is a gross simplification. It's much more complex than that, and Hamas has wider roots than that. And I heard a report yesterday, I think it was, from a Palestinian Authority spokesperson who was saying that the standing of Hamas, not to do with October the 7th, but to do with the fact that they are perceived to be resisting, that the standing of Hamas is going up in the West Bank as well. And you can see that, in a sense, I think, by the attacks that have taken place in Jenin, which is an area that allegedly is one that is supportive of Hamas and so on. So I'm not optimistic about the attitude of the Israeli government, about their willingness to come to talks. I think they had a paper that was presented very early on, actually, on the 13th of October, which spelt out three options. The first of those was that the population remain in Gaza and that the Palestinian Authority should rule it. Well, that's been dismissed already by Netanyahu and the others, who are saying that they regard Fatah and they regard the Palestinian Authority as only differing from Hamas, in that Hamas want to get rid of Israel today, and the Palestinian Authority wants to get rid of the Israelis over a slightly longer period. So that's ruled out. Option B is that the population remain in Gaza with the emergence of a local Arab authority. It's impossible, I think, to conceive of that without that being actually Hamas or politicians who come from that political sector. And the third option, option C, which tragically I fear is one that they will be seriously looking at, is what they say is the evacuation of the civilian population from Gaza into Sinai, to drive them out of historic Palestine completely and into Egypt. Those, I think, are the kind of scenarios that they're talking about. And I do think, I worry that the last one is one that they would have little compunction in trying to put into operation, because it's what many of them in the government, in the cabinet, and previously going back through the history of political Zionism, people like Jabotinsky and so on, is the kind of view that they had, that they wanted an Eretz Israel which extended beyond the Jordan Valley into what is now part of Jordan. They wanted it to extend to the Golan Heights and even into southern Lebanon, and they wanted it to expand across the Sinai. So there is a kind of mentality and a history of that kind of thinking within the Israeli body politic in terms of what to do. One of the things that I think may be challenging for the Israelis on a slightly different level, clearly the military contest, if you like, a war is continuing and is by no means resolved. And you can see that from what has happened in recent days, with fatalities being taken on the Israeli army side. But what is other factors that come into play are what might happen with the Israeli economy. And it's interesting reading some of the economic commentators on this about the fact that the Israeli economy has already lost, I think it's something like $16 billion since the outbreak of the war. There's been a massive decline in tourism, which is a not insignificant part of the GDP. And the number of flights leaving Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv have dropped, or had dropped when this report was written, from 500 down to 100. They're seeing, because Israel has a reserve army as well as a kind of professional army. Many of those reservists have left their jobs And so there are areas of work that are being neglected, and that is potentially causing some sort of challenge. So we're seeing all of those things coming into play. So there are other factors, if you like, beyond the purely military one, and I think it's a mistake just to look at that look at the military equation in isolation. I think because Israel has more firepower, that means it can result in an outright sort of victory. And it's very interesting to hear, for example, the United States Secretary of State for Defense, Lloyd Austin, who said that what Israel risks is a strategic defeat unless it protects Palestinian civilians in Gaza. So there are sections within the United States administration who I think have a more cautious, even more cautious attitude, and who would want to kind of suggest that the Israelis kind of draw in their horns in terms of what they're doing. Very quickly, in terms of can there be peace? Well, yes, there can, of course, be peace. But the question is, will there be justice? And that's the important thing, because peace without justice will not be lasting. It will not result in a development that is positive. It has to be something that goes beyond tokenism and be real justice for the Palestinians. And only the Palestinians can decide that at the end of the day. But what we do know from past experiences is that if you look at any conflict in a national liberation struggle, which is what I would argue this is, you will see that the so-called major power has in the end finished up having to talk to those it was fighting against. This has happened in Ireland. We've seen it not only in the 1920s, but of course more recently. We've seen it in Africa with the ANC and the end of apartheid, and we've seen it in other parts of the world. So a real peace and justice would have to talk to representatives of all of the Palestinian people. It would have to result in a conclusion, in my view, that established a Palestinian state and not some kind of Bantustanization like the Oslo Accords resulted in. And I think that will come about not just because of the resilience and the resistance of the Palestinian people, which undoubtedly is there, but also because of international solidarity. And that's something I hope perhaps we can discuss in the course of this meeting. And the last thing that it has to contribute to that is a change, in my view, in internal Israeli politics. I have to be honest and say I don't see that happening in a short space of time. I don't see the breakup of the kind of coalition that exists there, and I don't see a diminution of the kind of chauvinism that drives the racist and reactionary politics that are there. But I do think that it's an issue that we have to continue discussing and working in solidarity with the Palestinian people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernard. That was hugely informative. I hope everyone else found it as informative as I did. Just to say, like, we're joined by loads of you on Zoom tonight, but also from around the country, so including Swaffham, Cambridge, Edinburgh, Sheffield, Stockport, Somerset, Derbyshire, Hastings, Gateshead, Liverpool, Leeds, North and South London, multiple locations, but also Spain and Norway, so internationally as well. I'm just going to give you all a reminder to post your questions in the Q&A if you haven't done so yet. Going to give Bernard like a 30-second breather, and I'm gonna hand over for a minute to Ben Hayes, who is a volunteer and is going to tell us a bit more about today's organisers and what you can do to support, and then we're going to come back to Bernard with a couple of questions. So Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just been asked to say a few words on behalf of the Arise volunteer team. Firstly, as those of you who are regular attendees will be aware, these events do require funds to put on, whether that's booking a physical venue or using streaming platforms for online forums such as this. So if you are able to contribute towards those costs in this season of giving, it is very much appreciated by all of us. And speaking of events, we've got a diary date for next year on Saturday the 17th of February. Where I was putting on a day school in London with MPs, trade unionists, campaigners, academics, and international guests discussion of a range of topics covering both domestic politics and economics, as well as various global issues. So it'd be great to see you there. The links both for donating and to register for that event should be being posted in the chat. So thanks for coming along this evening and listening to this appeal, and hand you back over.
Thank you, Ben. Right, I'm going to go to our first batch of questions now. So we've had, I think, unsurprisingly, a number of questions, including, an example being John on Zoom, and a number of questions that relate to how the recent attacks and the increase in settlements is a two-state still a potential future. We've got also a number of questions sort of raising the issue of how the mainstream media portray the Gaza and the Palestinian Authority as, independent, and not really giving a proper reflection of the illegal occupation. So, for example, Sue saying that still too often we hear on the mainstream media the narrative of Israel not having any control over Gaza or the West Bank, being dependent on Israel for water is not being independent. And then I think linked to this as well, Agresta sort of saying a bit more about how Israel has been expanding aggressions and abuses of international law in the West Bank too in the recent period, while the focus has understandably been on Gaza. So a bit more information about what's been going on in the West Bank. So that's your first batch, Bernard. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Sian. I've made a note. Hopefully I'll address them, but do tell me, interrupt me if I'm not dealing with them. Okay, so I think the big crunch question probably of the four, if I may just single it out, is the issue of one state and two states. And this relates to the question that we're really trying to address, and that is, can Palestine be free? And the truth of the matter is that essentially the negotiations that took place in Oslo in the 1990s between, I think it was about 92 and 94 or 5, resulted in a process which was meant to lead to the establishment of two states. And what it did was it divided the West Bank in particular into 3 zones of operation, zones A, B, and C. Zone A was an area which was meant to be solely under the control of the Palestinian Authority. Zone B was meant to be one in which there was coordination between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli Authority. And Zone C was meant to be the area exclusively under the control of the Israelis. Now, the percentage of the area of those 3 groups was by no means equal. The percentage in Area A, I think, was around about 3-4% of the land area of the West Bank. The area that was governed allegedly jointly by the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority was about 24%. And the area exclusively under the control of the Israelis, that is Area C, was 74%. And Oslo was described by the Palestinian intellectual Edward Said as the Palestinians' Versailles. In other words, it was a settlement which was wholly and exclusively detrimental to the Palestinians. And in the course of the period that has followed that, what we've witnessed is an absolute explosion of, sorry to use that language, but a massive, massive and rapid increase and expansion of settlement buildings across the whole of the West Bank and across large swathes of the area of East Jerusalem, to the extent that there are now, and estimates vary because it literally is changing by the day, but there are probably in excess of 700,000, 800,000 Israeli Jewish citizens living in settlements in the West Banks. And those settlements sound like a temporary scenario, but they are towns. They are wholly built new towns with all the facilities that are required for, civil and civic services, and they're joined by roads that are exclusively for their use from those settlements into Israel, like umbilical cords connecting them. And the Palestinians are excluded from those roads, as well, of course, as being excluded entirely from the settlements. So if you were to look at a map of the West Bank, and I'm sorry, I don't have it ready, and I apologize for that, but if you looked at a current map of those areas that are inhabited by the Palestinians and those areas that are under allegedly under exclusive Palestinian control, it's very, very few. And even, by the way, and I've been to the West Bank many times, even in those areas that are allegedly under the exclusive control of the Palestinian Authority, the Israeli military are at the gates and at the entrances and exits and go into those areas, and arrest people and so on and so forth. So this 74%, by the way, that they control, some of it is extremely important economically. The Jordan Valley, which was a center of Palestinian agriculture, is a large part of that percentage. They designated some of them as, environmental zones in allegedly, greenwashing their occupation. And others are literally military live free fire zones for practice by the IDF, and therefore they say no Palestinians can go into those areas. And we've seen recently they've been smashing up not only accommodation but schools in places like Masafayata in the South Hebron Hills recently. So what I'm describing in terms of this one state, two state is that the credibility of having two separate states with very clear borders that people think about when they look at the map of 1967. It's the Israelis that are destroying any potential for a two-state solution. They are destroying it. So I think that it's a question that will come up, and it's coming up, organically from a variety of sources. It's not just, if you like, people on the left outside looking in and saying, well, wouldn't it be easy? I mean, it won't be easy, because even a one state would require justice for the Palestinians, as I said when I was concluding, my remarks earlier. And that means the right of return, the right for Palestinian refugees who now live in Jordan or in Lebanon or in Syria or other parts of the world to return to their homeland. It would mean reparations for the properties and businesses that were stolen from the Palestinians in 1948 and in 1967. And of course, in the case of Gaza, it would mean the reparations for all the damages that have been done and the rebuilding of all of that. So one state or two state, the political challenges, if you like, are very similar and clearly are huge. So that's really a difficulty. In terms of the mainstream media and the way they present it about Gaza and the Palestinian Authority, I, have to say that the notion that Hamas is a kind of military organization exclusively conducting a set of military operations, and they don't have any roots in the mass of people, or that alternatively that the mass of people do not perceive them as politically leaders in Gaza and in sections of the West Bank, is just a completely lunatic, one has to say, way of looking at the situation with any kind of gravity or any kind of attempt to grapple with that reality. It's much more complex. In 2006, I think I said earlier, they won the legislative elections. In 2007-8, they were on the verge of creating a unity government with Fatah, who was the other main political party. Sorry. And they had a political program which was, unexceptional, I think, in the sense of social engagement around education and health and so on and so forth. And the elections that they were elected in 2006, after the West had been baying at the Palestinians to have elections, the elections that Hamas won, by the way, were designated by the Carter Center, founded by Jimmy Carter, the former US president, were described as completely democratic. That was what they said. They sent observers and everything was totally above board. So the mainstream media's kind of understanding of this is just to imbibe, if you like, the Israeli ideas about how to look at this. And it's inadequate, and it won't harm us to parrot, if you like, those kind of conceptions of things. I want to just say something about something I didn't touch on, and I meant to, and that was the whole question of the United Kingdom's relationship with Israel, because this is a major issue, and I think it will be an issue going forward, certainly in the event of a general election and in terms of questions to put to the political parties. And that is a document which is called the 2030 UK-Israel Roadmap. And this is a document which has 10 sections to it, which go through in detail areas that there is going to be cooperation. And it includes, for example, defense and security, trade and investment, cyber intelligence, science, innovation and technology, climate, health, culture, education and higher education, development and gender. And all of these, they're looking to collaborate. And it's framed by an expression that the British government describes the Israeli government as a strategic partner. And it goes on to say that they will be promoting the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism as the framework within which this whole process is taking place. So I think we can expect, even more ideological offensives around the right to debate about Israel as a state and its government and its actions. My apologies, Sian, if that was rather long, but yeah, I was provoked.
No, that was great. Thank you. And actually, how you ended leads really neatly onto sort of the next set of questions that I was going to come on to, because there were a number of questions on the US role, and it's linked to the role and the view of the British government. So we had sort of David on Zoom sort of saying, can you envisage anything, that might meet, that Israel would do that would meet US disapproval? Is it even, is there a possibility of Biden changing his stance? And then I think sort of like linked to that, there's a number of sort of questions, including from Logan, who sort of says, with the UN voting overwhelmingly to support a ceasefire in recent days, is Britain's consistent towing of the US policy line, how does that isolate Britain internationally in the kind of today's new geopolitical world? And that links to another question which has come up, which is, what role has Britain's colonial past in Palestine? Going back to the Balfour Declaration that you wrote about, how has that history played into how the situation now has developed? How is it reflected in our current role? And I guess also, and how Britain sees Israel as its strategic partner going forward, as you were just saying. And then I think sort of linked to the British role, how, I think it's worth drawing attention to Zara Sultana's recent efforts in Parliament, and wondered if you had any comments on why Labour should support the call, not just for a ceasefire now, but also the call to end the selling of arms to Israel. That's obviously going to be a potential question that comes up in the general election, likely next year. So that's sort of another batch of questions for you.
Okay. In terms of whether there is a red line, if you like, that Israel might cross that would lead to the United States withdrawing its support, looking at it at the moment, they're committing so many outrages, I find it hard to think of one. But I suppose, being realistic, I think they would be anxious about the possibility of creating a regional conflict. And so by that, I mean that I think they are cautious about what might happen in the case of Hezbollah in the north in relation to Lebanon, and the possibility that that might kind of explode into a more serious conflagration with not just, if you like, the current exchange of fire that's taking place, which is resulting in fatalities, we shouldn't forget that, but a more generalized war. The Israelis are, of course, occupying the Golan Heights illegally, according to the United Nations, which belong to Syria. So if they went further than that, and by the way, they did bomb Damascus in the last few days, so they are quite capable of doing these things. And those things, I think, might lead to questioning. And also, I think, in relation to Egypt, I suppose if they did decide that they were going to literally drive all of the Palestinians out of Gaza into the Sinai, I think that may well cause a rupture, a more serious rupture with the Egyptians because of their anxieties about the developments there. Because after all, when the last election took place, a party was elected which was connected with the Islamic Brotherhood, who have historic links with Hamas and so on. So in other words, there is a mass political base inside Egypt for support for the Palestinians, which, if the Egyptians were to collaborate in any sort of way with the Israelis in a transfer of people, I think that might have some sort of impact. In relation to the UK being isolated, well, I think, this is where it's interesting when you look at what they did, because they didn't actually vote with the Americans. They didn't veto the resolution that came forward at the Security Council. They abstained. They didn't vote against the resolution that came to the United Nations General Assembly. They abstained. Again, in the Security Council, a further vote, they abstained. And again, with a second General Assembly vote, they abstained once more. So I think that indicates there are some anxieties, if you like, probably tied to the fact of Britain having arms contracts with some of the countries in the Middle East, and that being a very significant part of the equation. But it is clearly the case that the British government representatives are not going to break with the USA, but on the other hand, they're playing a more subdued role in order not to be drawn in. Having said that, the British sent warships to the Eastern Mediterranean as well. They're operating drones out of Cyprus, allegedly to try to identify where the hostages are being held. Of course, when you're doing that, you're simultaneously providing the Israeli military with potential targets in Gaza. So, the British are not, they have blood on their hands too, in my view. In terms of kind of Britain's colonial record, well, it's absolutely clear that its legacy is very evident in what is happening today in Gaza and what is happening to the Palestinians. And I'll put it this way, for the first, from the point of view when the British occupied Palestine in 1917, and people forget that Britain occupied it from 1917 right the way through to 1948. So everything that happened in that time period was a consequence of British imperial, British colonial rule. And they subdued the Palestinians who were seeking to gain independence right from the early 1920s. They treated them with complete disdain, and they were utterly arrogant and racist towards the Palestinians in terms of their refusal to engage in a serious discussion with them. And that went by the way of denying any kind of potential structures that could be established to form, if you like, a putative state, the beginnings of processes that would lead to the establishment of a Palestinian state, which, by the way, in those days, the Palestinians were clearly saying would be one that was for all those people who resided in Palestine. In other words, it was not a Palestinian state and a Palestinian Arab state. It wasn't a Muslim state. It wasn't a Muslim and Christian Palestinian state. It was a state for all, including the Jews who were living in Palestine at the time. And that was denied. So that was a whole denial of democratic rights that took place. The biggest challenge, if you like, in my view, which really was a decisive part of the history, but is not talked about enough, and that was the uprising in 1936 to 1939 by the Palestinians, called the Thawra, which means revolt or revolution. When they, in 1935-36, they called a general strike, which took place across the whole of Palestine. They formed national committees, which were local organizations, which were supporting and providing aid and assistance to the guerrilla fighters who were conducting a war against the British. And you can read military commentators who will say to you, this was not Palestinian versus Jewish or Zionist settlers at the time. It was a fight by the Palestinians against the British. And the British used tactics which have been used subsequently by the Israeli Defense Force. They used human shields. The British did that. The British used collective punishment. The British used the destruction of houses and villages where they perceived or they alleged supporters of the uprising were being lodged. They carried out the decimation of villages, literally, like the word comes from Roman times. They brought everybody out, all the male members of a village, brought them out and shot every 10th member of the village. That's what the British did in 1936-39, and it's well documented. And some of the torture that they inflicted on Palestinian prisoners was absolutely horrendous. Running the gauntlet through soldiers wielding bayonets, trying to stab them, and all sorts of other horribly gruesome things, which are documented and are there. That's the British legacy. And it wasn't just that they were doing that, but members of the paramilitary organizations of the Zionist bodies, like the Irgun and various other groupings, were working alongside the British when that suppression of the Palestinian Revolution was taking place in 1930-69. So they knew and learned all of those things. They carried out a systematic examination of every town and village in Palestine, working out the size of its population, its composition, its political character, whether it had been supportive of the uprising in 36-39. They documented that. Just in a way, now the Israelis are using artificial intelligence to kind of document the whole of Gaza, partition it, and target those areas where they perceive Hamas or resistance is taking place. The last thing was the question of the parliamentary efforts and the selling of arms. Well, certainly, I think at this moment in time, as South Africa has done, diplomatic relations should be cut. It's a symbolic gesture, but nevertheless, it's a very emphatic statement of repudiation of the way in which Israel is acting towards the Palestinians. And I certainly think that the British government should cease all sales of arms, which it does, and alleges, as somebody said earlier on, high moral standards for its criteria for deciding to whom they should sell them. But we know that's a complete and utter nonsense. So yes, there are things that Britain could do, and things that the solidarity movement is developing, like the boycott campaign, which has seen in recent days Puma withdrawing its sponsorship of the Israeli football team. And of course, these are symbolic, but they're important messages that go to the Palestinians. When I talk to friends in Palestine, in the West Bank, and Palestinian friends inside Israel, they are very, very aware of the demonstrations that we hold and of activity that we're engaged in. They're grateful for that. And we know, of course, that will not resolve everything, but it's an important message to send to Palestine.
Thank you so much, Bernard, and thank you so much for this evening's event. I think it's been hugely informative and a really an hour well spent in your company, I think, for us all. So I'm just gonna, I think those last remarks of yours were a great place to end, actually. So I'm gonna just make some final concluding remarks before we close the event, if that's okay. I want to thank everyone for coming along. I want to thank the volunteers for making tonight possible. I would hope that we see some of you in the audience at the Arise Day School in February next year. And please also do make sure that you join the Palestine Solidarity campaign and support the local and national actions that they are organising and will continue to organise, calling for a ceasefire now and other demands that come up. Online, our next discussion in the sort of socialist ideas sessions is on Rosa Luxemburg in January. It's a great start to your 2024. And details have been posted in the chat. And we hope to see you there as well. So thank you very much to Bernard and for all of you. And I'm going to close the event there. Thank you and have a happy new year.